The Other Death. About 2 years ago, I believe it was, I've lost the letter, Gannon wrote me from Gualeguaychú to announce that he was sending me a translation, perhaps the first to be done into Spanish, of Ralph Waldo Emerson's poem, The Past. In a postscript, he added that Pedro Damian, a man he said he knew I'd remember, had died a few nights earlier of pulmonary congestion. He'd been ravaged by fever, Gannon said, and in his delirium had relived that bloody day at Masola. The news struck me as predictable and even trite, because at 19 or 20, Pedro Damian had followed the banners of Aparicio Saravia. The 1904 uprising had caught him unawares on a ranch in Rio Negro or Paysandú, where he was working as a common labourer. Damian was from Entre Rios, Gualeguay to be exact, but where his friends went, he went, just as spirited and ignorant a fellow as they were. He fought in the occasional hand-to-hand skirmish, and in that last battle, repatriated in 1905, he went back, with humble tenacity, to working in the fields. So far as I am aware, he never left his province again. He spent his last 30 years on quite a solitary little farm a league or two from the Nansei. It was in that god-forsaken place that I spoke of him one evening in 1942, or tried to speak with him. He was a man of few words and little learning. The sound and fury of Masola were the full extent of his story. It came as no surprise to me that he had relived those times as he lay dying. I had learned that I would never see Damian again, and so I tried to recall him. My visual memory is so bad that all I could remember was a photograph that Gannon had taken of him. That too is not particularly remarkable. If you consider that I saw the man himself but once, in early 1942, but saw the photograph countless times. Gannon sent me the photo. I've lost it, but now I've stopped looking for it. I'd be afraid to find it. The second episode took place in Montevideo, months later. The fever and agonizing death of the man from Entre Rios suggested to me a tale of fantasy based on the defeat at Masola. When I told the plot of the story to Emir Rodriguez Monagal, he gave me a letter of introduction to Colonel Dionisio Tabares, who had led the campaign. The colonel received me after dinner. From his comfortable rocking chair out in the courtyard, he lovingly and confusedly recalled the old days. He spoke of munitions that never arrived and of exhausted horses, of grimy, sleepy men weaving labyrinths of marches, and of Saravia, who could have entered Montevideo but turned aside because gauchos have an aversion to the city, of men whose throats were slashed to the spine, of a civil war that struck me as more some outlaw's dream than the collision of two armies. He talked about Illescas, Tupambay, Masola, and did so of such perfectly formed periods and so vividly that I realized that he'd told these same stories many times before. Indeed, it all made me fear that behind his words hardly any memories remained. As he took a breath, I managed to mention the name Damian. Damian? Pedro Damian? The colonel said. He served with me, a little Indian-like fellow the boys called Dayman. He began a noisy laugh, but suddenly cut it off with real or pretended discomfort. It was in another voice that he said that war, like women, served to test a man. Before a man goes into battle, he said, no man knows who he truly is. One fellow might think himself a coward and turn out to be a brave man, or it might be the other way around, which is what happened to that poor Damian, who swaggered around the pulperias with his white ribbon and then fell apart in Masola. There was one shootout with the Zumacos where he'd acted like a man, but it was another thing when the army squared off and the cannon started in and every man felt like 5,000 other men had ganged up to kill him. Poor little mestizo bastard. He'd spent his whole life dipping sheep and all of a sudden he'd gotten himself swept up in that call to defend the nation. Absurdly, Colonel Tabares' version of the events embarrassed me. I'd have preferred that they had not have taken place quite that way. Out of the age Damian, a man I had a glimpse of on a single afternoon, and that many years ago I had unwittingly constructed a sort of idol, Tabares' version shattered it. Suddenly I understood Damian's reserve and stubborn solitude. They had been dictated not by modesty, but by shame. Futilely I told myself over and over that a man pursued by an act of cowardice is more complex and more interesting than a man who is merely brave. The gaucho, Martin Fierro, I thought, is less memorable than Lord Jim or Razumov. Yes, but Damian, as a gaucho, had an obligation to be Martin Fierro, especially so in the company of Uruguayan gauchos. With respect to what Tabares said, and failed to say, I caught the gamey taste of what was called artiguismo, the perhaps unarguable awareness that Uruguay is more elemental than our own country, and therefore wilder. I recall that night we said our goodbyes with exaggerated effusiveness. That winter, the lack of one or two details for my tale of fantasy, which stubbornly refused to find its proper shape, made me return to Colonel Tabares' house. I found him with another gentleman of a certain age, Dr. Juan Francisco Amaro of Paysandu, who had also fought in Saravilla's uprising. There was talk, predictably enough, of Masola. Amaro told a few anecdotes, and then, slowly, like a man thinking out loud, he added, "We stopped for the night on the Santa Irene Ranch, I remember, and some new men joined up with us. Among them, there was a French veterinarian who died the day before the battle, and a sheep shearer, a young kid from Entre Rios, named Pedro Damian." I interrupted sharply. "I know," I said. "The Argentine kid that fell apart under fire." I stopped. The two men were looking at me perplexedly. "I beg your pardon, sir," Amaro said, at last. "Pedro Damian died as any man might wish to die. It was about 4 in the afternoon. The Red Infantry had dug in on the peak of the hill. Our men charged them with lances. Damian led the charge, yelling, and a bullet got him straight in the chest. He stopped stock still, finished his yell, and crumpled, and his body was trampled under the hoofs of the horses. He was dead, and the final charge at Masola rolled right over him. Such a brave man, and not yet 20. He was undoubtedly talking about another Damian, but something made me ask what the young mestizo was yelling. "Curses," the colonel said, "which is what you yell in charges." "That may be," said Amaro, "but he was also yelling, 'Viva Urquiza.'" We fell silent. Finally the colonel murmured, "Not as though he was fighting at Masola, but at Cagancha or India Muerta 100 years before." Then, honestly perplexed, he added, "I commanded those troops, and I'd swear that this is the first time I heard any mention of any Damian." We could not make him remember. In Buenos Aires, another incident was to make me feel yet again that shiver that the colonel's forgetfulness had produced in me. Down in the basement of Mitchell's English bookshop, I came upon Patricio Gannon one afternoon, standing before the 11 delectable volumes of the works of Emerson. I asked him how his translation of The Past was going. He said he had no plans to translate it. Spanish literature was tedious enough already without Emerson. I reminded him that he had promised me the translation in the same letter in which he'd written me the news of Damian's death. He asked me who this Damian was. I told him but drew no response. With the beginnings of a sense of terror, I saw that he was looking at me strangely, so I bluffed my way into a literary argument about the sort of person who'd criticize Emerson, a poet more complex, more accomplished, and unquestionably more remarkable, I contended, than poor Edgar Allan Poe. There are several more events I should record. In April I had a letter from Colonel Dionisio Tabares. He was no longer confused. Now he remembered quite well the Entre Rios boy who'd led the charge at Masola and been buried by his men that night at the foot of the hill. In July I passed through Gualeguaychú. I couldn't manage to find Damian's rundown place. Nobody remembered him anymore. I tried to consult the storekeeper, Diego Abarroya, who had seen him die. Abarroya had passed away in the fall. I tried to call to mind Damian's features. Months later, as I was browsing through some albums, I realized that the somber face I had managed to call up was the face of the famous tenor Tamberlik in the role of Othello. I pass now to hypotheses. The simplest, but also the least satisfactory, posits 2 Damians, the coward who died in Entre Rios in 1946 and the brave man who died at Masola in 1904. The problem with that hypothesis is that it doesn't explain the truly enigmatic part of it all, the curious comings and goings of Colonel Tabares' memory, the forgetfulness that wipes out the image and even the name of the man that was remembered such a short time ago. I cannot, accept the even simpler hypothesis that I might have dreamed the first remembering. More curious yet is the supernatural explanation offered by Ulrike von Kuhlmann. Pedro Damian, Ulrike suggests, died in the battle and at the hour of his death prayed to God to return him to Entre Rios. God hesitated a second before granting that favour, and the man who had asked it was already dead, and some men had seen him killed. God, who cannot change the past, although he can change the images of the past, changed the image of death into one of unconsciousness, and the shade of the man from Entre Rios returned to his native land. Returned, but we should recall that he was a shade, a ghost. He lived in solitude, without wife, without friends. He loved everything, possessed everything, but from a distance as though from the other side of a pane of glass. He died, but his gossamer image endured, like water within water. That hypothesis is not correct, but it ought to have suggested the true one, the one that today I believe to be the true one, which is both simpler and more outrageous. I discovered it almost magically in Pierre Damiani's treatise titled De Omnipotentia, which I sought out because of 2 lines from Canto 21 of the Paradiso, 2 lines that deal with the problem of identity. In the 5th chapter of his treatise, Pierre Damiani maintains against Aristotle and Fredegarius of Tours that God can make what once existed never to have been, I read those old theological arguments and began to understand the tragic story of Don Pedro Damian. This is the way I imagine it. Damian behaved like a coward on the field of Masola, and he dedicated his life to correcting that shameful moment of weakness. He returned to Entre Rios, he raised his hand against no man, he marked no one, he sought no reputation for bravery, but in the fields of Nankay, dealing with the brushy wilderness and the skittish livestock, he hardened himself. Little by little he was preparing himself, unwittingly, for the miracle. Deep inside himself he thought, if fate brings me another battle, I will know how to deserve it. For 40 years he awaited that battle with vague hopefulness, and fate at last brought it to him, at the hour of his death. It brought it in the form of a delirium, but long ago the Greeks knew that we are the shadows of a dream. In his dying agony he relived his battle, and he acquitted himself like a man. He led the final charge and took a bullet in the chest. Thus, in 1946, by the grace of his long-held passion, Pedro Damian died in the defeat at Masola, which took place between the winter and spring of the year 1904. The Summa Theologica denies that God can unmake what once existed, but it says nothing about the tangled concatenation of causes and effects, which is so vast and so secret that it is possible that not a single remote event can be annulled, no matter how insignificant, without cancelling the present. To change the past is not to change a mere single event, it is to annul all its consequences, which tend to infinity. In other words, it is to create two histories of the world. What we might call the first, Pedro Damian died in Entre Rios in 1946. In the second, he died at Masola in 1904. This latter history is the one we are living in now, but the suppression of the former one was not immediate, and it produced the inconsistencies I have reported. In Colonel Dionisio Tabares, we can see the various stages of this process. At first he remembered that Damian behaved like a coward, then he totally forgot him. Then he recalled his impetuous death. The case of the storekeeper Abaroya is no less instructive. He died, in my view, because he too had many memories of Don Pedro Damian. As for myself, I don't think I've run a similar risk. I have guessed at and recorded a process inaccessible to humankind, a sort of outrage to rationality, but there are circumstances that mitigate that awesome privilege. For the moment, I am not certain that I have always written the truth. I suspect that within my tale there are false recollections. I suspect that Pedro Damian, if he ever existed, was not called Pedro Damian, and that I remember him under that name in order to be able to believe, someday in the future, that his story was suggested to me by the arguments of Pierre Damiani. Much the same thing occurs with that poem that I mentioned in the first paragraph, the poem whose subject is the irrevocability of the past. In 1951 or thereabouts I will recall having concocted a tale of fantasy, but I will have told the story of a true event in much the way that naive Virgil, 2,000 years ago, thought he was heralding the birth of a man, though he had foretold the birth of God. Poor Damian. Death carried him off at 20 in a war he knew nothing of and in a homemade sort of battle. Yet though it took him a very long time to do so, he did at last achieve his heart's desire, and there is perhaps no greater happiness than that.